Honors Chemistry students. Today we're going to be doing the identification of cations and anions lab. We're going to be doing the first part, Part A, where we are testing for an unknown anion, which right here, this is our unknown anion, test tube number 10. If we were doing this in class, you would all have different unknowns, different numbers of test tubes, but make sure, even though you all have the same unknown, write down that you're doing unknown number 10. So the first test that we're going to perform 4 different anion tests. So this unknown is one of 4. The first test we're going to do is a chloride test for chloride ion. Then the next one will be the sulfate test, then bicarbonate, and then phosphate. So those are our 4 different anions that we are testing for. So our first test, to test for chloride ion, I'm going to take one of these test tubes and add some chloride ion into it. This is our known, and we really don't have to worry about how much we add. We just want to use approximately the same amount, so I'm not going to worry about measuring this out or anything like that. So I've got about this much of our known ion. So sodium chloride has chloride ion in it. And then I'm going to add to the other test tube about the same amount of our unknown. Okay, so now if our unknown has chloride ion in it, when I add the other chemicals to it, it will do the same thing as the one with our known. So this one has the chloride ion in it. This one we don't know. So the next thing we're going to do is add some nitric acid. I know it says 2 milliliters, but again, we're not really too worried about amounts. And what I do to one, I'm going to do to the other. So I added that to the one that does have chloride ion in it. I did the same thing, about the same amount to that one. And it's probably hard to see on the video, but that you could see the two mixing. Didn't really do anything, but make sure you're recording in your data tables what chemicals we're adding and what happens to them. And then the third chemical that we're going to add to both test tubes is silver nitrate. So here's the one that has the chloride ion in it. And what you can see is this is forming a white cloudy material. That's actually what we call a precipitate. It's forming a solid. So if I don't know if you can see that at all any better, but there's little solid chunks of white. That's precipitate. Now if this has chloride ion in it, it will do the same thing. And unfortunately, no, it really doesn't, it really doesn't do the same thing. So that's our first test. And again, in your data table, record the chemicals that you added and the results. So the one that did have the chloride ion formed a white precipitate. The one that our unknown did not form a white precipitate. So therefore, we can assume that our unknown does not have chloride ion in it. So I'm going to rinse these two out and get ready for our next test. Okay, so that was our first test for chloride ion. The second test we're testing for is for sulfate ion. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add a little bit of our unknown. Let's get all the excess water out. A little bit of our unknown to the one test tube, and then a little bit of sodium sulfate to the other. Okay, so I don't have quite as much in there, but that's okay. All right, so again, this is our test tube that has the anion sulfate in it. This one has our unknown. So now the next step to the second test is we now add 2 milliliters of hydrochloric acid. So we'll just add a little bit of hydrochloric acid to both test tubes. And you can see them mixing. All right, still look the same. Okay, and then our next step is to add some barium chloride. So again, this time when we add barium chloride, you can see it too is forming a white cloudy precipitate. And to this one, to our unknown, it does not. So again, the fact that we formed a precipitate in here tells us that we have sulfate. Here in our unknown, since it does not do the same thing, that means we do not have sulfate ion in our unknown. Okay, so again, make sure you record your observations and the results. So that was our sulfate test. Let's out our test tubes again. Okay, so our third test is testing for bicarbonate or hydrogen carbonate is the other name you can call it. So in our first test tube, I'm going to add some sodium bicarbonate or sodium hydrogen carbonate, however you want to call it. About that much. And then I'm going to add approximately the same amount of our unknown to the other test tube. Oof, keep adding a lot more to the other test tube. Again, it doesn't really matter. And then the only other thing we're going to add to this is, let me kind of zoom in a little bit so you can see up close. And I think you've actually done this reaction before in one of the first labs that we did. I'm going to add some hydrochloric acid. Make sure you can see this. So if you notice, we've got a lot of bubbling going on. And then not really much going on with our unknown. So again, our known, the one that does have the sodium bicarbonate, let's see if we can, yeah, it's all used up. Did some bubbling. That means it formed a gas when we see the bubbles. When we see those bubbles, that means the chemical reaction that took place between the hydrochloric acid and the sodium bicarbonate created a gas, and that's all those bubbles. Then when we added it to the hydrochloric acid to our unknown, it didn't do anything. There was no gas forming. So again, that means that our unknown is not bicarbonate. And so on to our last test, which by process of elimination means we should have phosphate as our unknown, but we're just going to do the tests and see what happens, see what results we get. So to our known test tube, I'm going to add some sodium phosphate. And to our unknown test tube, I'm going to add the rest of our unknown. Okay, then the next step is I'm going to add some nitric acid. And then the last step is, this is a fun one to say, ammonium molybdate. It says 10 drops. Again, we're not really worried too much about how much we have. We're not really measuring anything out. So I added. Now, it looks white, but that's, if you look closely at this bottle, it's white also. So that really doesn't mean anything. That's just, it's not really forming a precipitate. And then we're supposed to sit them in hot water bath for 5 minutes. So we'll give that a little bit of time. I should have started heating my water up a little earlier so it wouldn't take so long. And let's see what happens. So again, they're both still a little cloudy. Get you a little closer so you can see. It's kind of hard to tell from the video, but there is a slight yellowish color to the test tubes, more so in our known one than our unknown. But we'll give it a little bit of time. Really haven't had them in there that long. Let it heat up. And you can kind of start to see the unknown is starting to get a little more yellowish, like the one that has the phosphate ion in it. So let that, give that a couple more minutes to sit there and heat up, see what the final results are. Okay, so again, you can kind of see this one, the one with the unknown's a little paler than the known, but they both have turned a yellowish color. And the longer we let them sit, the brighter the yellow will become, and the clearer it will get. You can kind of see it's already cleared up a little bit. Okay, so the fact that they both did the same thing, they just, one's a little lighter than the other because of the different amounts. I really didn't worry too much about how much of each chemical I was adding, but they both turned yellow, so that tells us then that they both had phosphate ion. So our unknown is phosphate.